We always say seat time is king, so sit on down and listen in to Motorsports Tech Talk with your hosts, Brian and Eric. Eric, how's it going?
Pretty good, dude. 65 and sunny today in Michigan, so that's beautiful.
Oh, yeah.
Last indoor mini moto race of the season because we're moving outside because weather's good, at least for now. So, doing pretty good.
Is that going to be an improvement going outside?
Definitely. Like I'm looking forward to it. I'm not sure I'm doing the mini moto thing outside, right? Because I got the big boy, like got the R6 and you know all the stuff I'm actually gonna go race with. But I might pick up like a small supermoto bike. You know, and then it's just the generic difference between indoor and outdoor. Like all those indoor car tracks have polished concrete. So there's no grip. You know, whether you're karting or on a bike or whatever you're doing, you get more grip outside. So, but yeah, man, that's you know, today was a good day. So, what about you? How you feeling?
Oh, leaving things the last minute on the race car.
You have a race next weekend, don't you?
Yes, NCM, National Corvette Museum, NASA Great Lakes. It's spec me on. It's gonna be a blast. We got 20 people signed up right now, including me. So I think that's the biggest field I've driven in. I think maybe by one, but yeah, it should be a blast. And because of all those people showing up, I'm making the final push to get my new diff in because I would like to be. I think it'll be a good speed improvement, like I've said before. So
yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's going to be #lit fam. Quick question though, you did have all winter to do this?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I did have to do a trans swap, but of course I think I spent maybe 3 to 4 total hours. If you include driving to and from Ohio to drop it off to get rebuilt and pick it up, then it's maybe a day total. But yeah, no, I mean, yeah, that's just how that's how I go. I mean, it didn't help that I finished the sim rig, but then didn't really sim race on it. Just ended up playing kind of Call of Duty a lot instead. So that didn't help. So
yeah.
Note to self: don't start playing a video game right before season starts.
Yeah, way to go, bud.
But I think I'll be able to get it in. I mean, worst case is I don't, and the car's mostly ready to go. So, you know, I just run the same diff that I was able to get my first win on last year at NCM. So, and it looks like a little bit of rain on Sunday. So maybe I can get some deja vu going.
Hell yeah. Sounds good.
But yeah, so, in other news, the podcast that we're speaking on right now, we're going to be talking about turbos and superchargers, or I guess force induction in general.
Yeah.
All the boost.
I love boost.
Who doesn't, right? Like, I don't know. The only people who don't love boost is because they're jealous that they don't have it.
Yeah, exactly. Like, yeah.
And maybe people who just blew up their last engine because they had too much boost, but I don't know. They'll get over it.
Yeah,
they'll love it again.
Exactly. The people who blow up their engine from boost still come back to having boost. It's just those silly people who spend significantly more money building an NA engine with significantly less power that don't like boost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which, I mean, NA has its merits, but which we can get into. But yeah, let's talk about boost. So there's superchargers, turbochargers. We'll kind of split that up. I guess a good place to start is just the concept. So we've talked about engines before, and we're gonna assume you are aware of some basic things. So you have a cylinder, and if you can push more air in, then there's more oxygen you can burn, which means you will need more fuel. So there's, more that goes into it than just slapping on some sort of, hair dryer. But the general concept of boost is you're shoving more air in, which is just more oxygen. So you get more fuel and you get just more stuff in the cylinder, more power. Right.
Yeah, and for every 14.7 psi of pressure above ambient pressure you get in there, it's basically doubling your displacement effectively.
Mm-hmm.
However, there's some losses, and then the added temperature, which we'll get into. But so you won't always double your power for every roughly 15 psi. But I mean, that's how you can get. That's how some of these guys doing 4-cylinder drag race engines are getting over 1,000 horsepower out of like 2 liters.
Right.
They're just cramming it in there with as much pressure as they can before things go south.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess just to touch on it, the reason you're saying doubling your power at that specific PSI is because that's atmospheric. So you're just think about the air around you. You doubled the pressure of, in this scenario of ambient air, right? Would be the equivalent. So, right. That's where that number comes from. So.
Yeah, so you can simplify it by just converting to bar. So every extra bar is an extra, basically doubling of the power. So, and because of that, you can really get some crazy gains as you get to the bigger engines. Like if you're starting with like an 8-liter Viper engine and you're only putting a couple pounds of boost, it was already how much, like 600 horsepower or something, or 500.
Probably 5 something. They're surprisingly low, but
yeah.
I mean,
but if you get 15 psi on it, you're already almost to 1,000 basically.
Yeah, dude, nice and easy. So, I guess we understand we're throwing more air in. Maybe before we get into the hardware of the boost systems, we'll just say that, with the more air, you need more fuel. So people generally upgrade their fuel system. So it'll be bigger injectors, maybe some sort of fuel pressure regulator, depending on how that is on your car, bigger fuel pump. And that's just the generic approach. That's the minimum of what you need there. You're going to throw in a wideband O2 sensor in your exhaust. Wideband just means you're reading a longer or a wider range of oxygen in your exhaust. A narrow band, or what's on most cars, because they're already tuned for exactly what's in the car, they're ready to go. You don't need to be able to see these differences, and they're much simpler, I guess. So you get the wideband, and yeah, I mean, you'll end up changing your timing and your AFR targets. I suppose we can get into that after we talk about turbos and superchargers. Get into different fuels later, maybe.
I guess real quick, I guess a couple other considerations. Talking fuel system. Although most cars, I think, have them, even naturally aspirated, but having basically a rising rate fuel pressure regulator is very important. You need basically that boost pressure to be offset. Basically, it'll have a vacuum or pressure source going to the fuel pressure regulator, and it'll increase as boost pressure increases or decrease in vacuum. But the important thing is that it keeps the pressure that the injector is seeing constant. So if the air entering the cylinder is at 30 psi of boost, so 30 psi above that ambient pressure, then you need the fuel pressure to kind of compensate for that increase in pressure, so that through the boost range, the fuel is being metered properly, basically, or else the ECU would be very confused by everything changing constantly.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I mean, yeah, we could get into it now. Just usually you need a higher air fuel ratio, or I guess more fuel, but a lower number ratio. So, closer to 10 to 11 to 1 potentially on boosted engines, just because the higher pressure can lead to a lot more knock. It's more, and as well as the higher temperature. So part of it is you're adding more fuel to cool the higher intake temperatures, and then also it's to kind of allow for a little more resistance to knock, basically. But I guess real quick, to push it back a little further, the reason why the intake temperature is going to get so hot is because as air is compressed, the one of the byproducts is higher temperature. So it's kind of on that, Bernoulli, kind of some Bernoulli principles there. As you're increasing that pressure, something has to offset it, and it's going to be, since it's the same volume that we're talking about, at least the displacement of the engine, then temperature has to be the thing that increases.
Right.
I guess more we're talking about the volume of the compressor, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just the PV equals nRT thing, right? So
yeah,
and R and V are not changing, so it's P and T. She got.
Yep.
So
yeah, so the byproduct of that is temperature, which there's ways to combat, which we'll get into, but ultimately, I guess what I'm trying to get to is you need more fuel, or even even lower air fuel ratio. So that's more fuel per unit of air in order to compensate for those higher temps and that higher boost pressure.
Right. Yeah, and
I guess.
Well, just on the thermal thing.
Yeah. Sorry.
That's all right. Yeah, just on the thermal thing, we're talking about having more air going into the engine, so that T is going up, which is what you noted. But the T is also going up when the air is being initially compressed by our, I'll just call it a pump, whatever it is, turbo, supercharger. So it's a compounding effect. Things get, boost really makes things hot. So, it's a couple different places.
Yeah, and then I guess one last thing I wanted to get to on pressure wise is one thing I found interesting that I learned a few years back is you can start getting into issues with valve float with high enough boost pressures, because basically it's almost like the pressure inside the cylinder is holding the valves shut. So sometimes, I mean, if you're already doing a bunch of engine mods and trying to get a lot of extra horsepower, you're probably already doing cams and valve springs and stuff like that. But one thing to note is if you're going big, you got to be careful with keeping those, just having stock valve springs in there. I thought that was interesting that I learned a while back. But yeah, otherwise, like but those are all kind of the main principles of the turbocharging / supercharging, I guess, force induction. So I guess then we can get into those two major hardware groups.
Yeah. And I think, although they're, in my humble opinion, not as cool, turbos are definitely more popular. So why don't you talk to me about that a little bit?
Yeah. So the main difference between the two is basically whether it's mechanically driven or exhaust driven. So the exhaust driven version is known as the turbocharger. So what's nice about these is that they're using kind of waste energy that's already the exhaust is already been used. It's been your engine's combusted, and now it's just getting rid of all these hot spent gases. And now you get to use that extra energy that they have left that's left in it to then spin a turbine, which is then connected via a shaft to the compressor, and then that compressor is what's doing the boosting. So on that compressor side, you have an intake just like you would normally for the engine, but instead of going towards like the intake manifold that it normally would on a naturally aspirated engine, it's going straight into the turbo compressor. And then there's an outlet there that has the now compressed and pressurized gas or air, just air mix, just air at this point. And then that can either go right into the engine if you're, I don't know, if you're doing methanol injection or something, but or very low boost. I know I've talked about the Star Ion a bit here as I'm in the very, very long, slow process of building one for Champ Car, but the original, the first couple years of it had no intercooler, so yeah, it just went right in. But I think it was only like 4 or 5 psi of boost, almost not even worth it at that point.
Yeah.
But yeah, but most of the time you're going to get into an intercooler, and intercoolers are very common with both turbocharging and supercharging. But I think for the most part, for any modern engine, you will not see a turbocharger not paired with an intercooler. So the intercooler is just a heat exchanger, an air-to-air heat exchanger most of the time. It can be air-to-water, but most of the time it's air-to-air, so you just have the hot compressed air going through on one end, and then through the core, you have your ambient air flowing through and cooling down that really hot compressed air and trying to get it back towards ambient temperature. Now, you're never usually going to get down to ambient. I mean, obviously you need quite a lot of flow and maybe just the air to not be very hot going in to get it to ambient, but ultimately it's still going to be higher than ambient. But at least it'll get it a lot closer. I guess to give you perspective, I mean, depending on where you're operating in the turbocharger's kind of efficiency range, you could see as much as 150 C, which in F is, what is that? It's like over 300, I think.
Yeah, it should be over 300. That's huge. That's crazy.
So it can be very hot. Very, very, very hot. So so you definitely want to cool that off before it goes into the engine. So yeah, that's why you have your intercooler, and then from there it goes back to kind of where you'd expect to see everything. You have your throttle body, your intake manifold, and all that. So the rest of that's the same as kind of what we went over in our first engine episode, but you're just adding, honestly, quite a complex system of tubes, just like the internet. But a lot of it is a lot of extra hardware, and then on top of that, you have a lot more hot things. The turbocharger itself gets very hot, obviously, since it's connected to the exhaust. Mm-hmm. It has kind of a greater area to radiate around to things, and then you have these basically hot intercooler pipes too. And then you add another heat exchanger to the mix, and in front of your radiator most of the time, and yeah, it quickly becomes a temperature issue, which is which we'll get into, I think, once we go through both the turbo and supercharger. But comparing to naturally aspirated engines, it's kind of the biggest downside. It's just you have a lot of thermal issues to think about now.
Oh yeah.
But I guess other considerations with the turbocharger is it needs to be oiled. I mean, not usually, always needs to be oiled.
Yeah.
Very important, very important. So getting that oil source in a car that never had a turbocharger can be a little difficult because it was never designed to have it, because usually it needs a very specific pressure, which depends on what type of turbo it is. So I guess I can get into that real quick. You have your bearing, your center bearing that's supporting the shaft that's connected to turbine and the compressor. That center bearing is usually either ball bearing or a journal bearing. So your journal bearing being very similar to your engine's kind of rod bearings and Just your standard kind of oil. You get your oil film on a. Usually, it's a softer material like bronze, I believe. But you have that kind of a uh, oil lubricated bronze bushing that's the shaft is riding on. Or with your ball bearing, you have your balls within a race, and those can be, they're still oiled, but usually a lot lower pressure. So journal bearings usually need more pressure than ball bearing turbos, and if you put too much pressure into a ball bearing turbo, oil pressure, sometimes that can actually create some problems. You can blow out the seals on the ball bearings and things like that. So finding the right pressure feed can be a little tricky. On if you're starting with a turbocharged car, it's usually a lot easier because you know what turbo was on it.
So,
And
just real quick though, I mean, outside of demanding different oil pressures, is one of those better than the other, generically?
oh yeah, so um, generally people will prefer the ball bearing turbos. I mean, if you think about it, instead of having this kind of long journal with like a large surface area on kind of dragging on the shaft, instead now you just have usually two ball bearings with that really small contact area. So there's going to be a lot less friction with the ball bearing. So it can lead to better response and kind of spool up time, as they call it. So generally ball bearing is better, usually more expensive. So you get what you pay for.
Mm-hmm.
It does depend on your application. I think for any sort of form of racing where transients are very important, so road racing, autocrossing, really anything short of drag racing for the most part. Drag racing, you can get away with journal bearing. And I think it's easier for them to package a large journal bearing than it is very, very large ball bearings for those like 4,000, 6,000 horsepower crazy pro mod, or those crazy engines. So sometimes you only see journal bearings in the very, very big turbos. And I don't think they really have too much of a disadvantage in that condition because they have automatic transmission, or sometimes no transmission, just like a clutch. So there's never any like on-off throttle kind of thing, and usually they're stalled up on the torque converter if they have an auto trans, and basically everything's good to go, everything's boosted up, and at that point the bearing doesn't really matter. So generally ball bearing, and we talk a lot of road racing here, ball bearing's usually going to be kind of your better bet, but it's usually going to cost more.
Okay.
So I guess continuing with the oil system, obviously you also need a drain, which usually goes right into your oil pan. You want that to be kind of pretty large because you really don't want any, it's kind of, you don't want it to get all backed up, sort of. You need to get it all out of there as fast as you get it in. So usually the drain needs to be pretty big. And then the other thing that some turbos have and some don't is water cooling. So basically, whether or not you're water cooling that center section as well. Generally, it's definitely recommended. With the biggest benefit being basically when you stop, when you turn off your car after, maybe say you're doing a track day and everything's getting super, super hot, and then you just turn off the car. That oil is no longer flowing through the bearing housing, and it's just kind of sitting there in this really, really hot exhaust heated bearing housing, and it can cause the oil to kind of coke up in there, and then eventually lead to a failure. So I mean, you can avoid that by just letting your car idle for a very long, if in a track day scenario, for quite a while after you get off get out of the track. But for the most part, definitely would recommend water cooling. And it's any car that from the factory that comes turbocharged, it's going to have water cooled bearings. It's really only like kind of the cheaper aftermarket turbos that might not have it, and maybe in like a drag racing situation, it's not as needed as long as you know to cool everything off before you shut it off. But that kind of outlines the overall kind of turbocharger system. I mean, you also have a blow off valve. You have to relieve basically when the throttle closes, there's kind of a buildup of pressure between the turbo and that throttle plate, and it has to go somewhere. So having a blow-off valve or a bypass valve, I guess they can sometimes get interchanged, but they're technically different things. Basically, you need to relieve that pressure. If not, it'll cause surge, which could, in its worst case, snap the turbo in half, basically the shaft in half. But in its I guess best case, it just makes weird noises and causes some stalling of the compressor.
But, are those noises that everybody
I guess quickly,
likes to imitate?
Oh yeah, that's why Go Turbo is for the whoosh spoosh, whoosh.
This 2 2 2 2.
Yeah, those those very nice noises. So, which you can get with both the blow off and the bypass valve. The key difference being the bypass valve recirculates it back into the intake, since usually that's already, at least in a mass airflow system, it's already metered air. So if you just shoot it off in the atmosphere, then it's kind of air that was the engine's accounting for that's all of a sudden gone. So usually you'll see it in bypass, but if you have the good old speed density, which I forget if we got into in the last engine episode, but basically it's a control strategy based off of manifold pressure and temperature. If you have that set up, then you can just blow all that air into the atmosphere for even louder whooshes and whistles.
Yeah. So that I guess before you jump onto like wastegates, so that when you hear like some blow off valve noise, but then you hear the stu-tu-tu-tu. I hope everybody enjoyed that. When you hear that noise, is that actual surging? Right? Is that because the blow off valve isn't relieving enough air, or what's after the psh, what's going on with the 2 2 2 2 part?
Yeah, generally if it's just a psh, I hope that wasn't too loud. After that, that's usually all you should get in a kind of a properly functioning system. Mm-hmm. So it could be two things. Yeah, it could be that surge that I was talking about. And that's going to be based on, I guess, maybe the blow-off valve not being big enough. I think, I guess I've never had this problem. It's hard to kind of, for me to diagnose it. But the other thing, which I've had before, where is basically there's a spring within the blow-off valve that's based on the boost pressure you're running. So if you start to run too much boost pressure, it could just be the blow-off valve's kind of cracking open, and as you're letting off. I guess that's a different thing then. I guess if you're running too high of a spring pressure, then I think what'll happen is it'll only open slightly at the very high boost, and then it'll kind of keep opening and closing. So okay. That's more of a blow-off valve setup issue. Mm-hmm. But it could also be surging as well.
Okay.
But I don't know exactly what causes that. But so it's generally not a good noise, although we all think it sounds cool. So,
right.
I guess, you can go for that, I guess, if you want. So yeah, I guess, to finish off the blow-off valve, it does have, it usually has a vacuum line or a pressure line, depending on whether the throttle's closed or not, that goes to the intake manifold, and that's what tells it to open. So as soon as the throttle closes and the intake manifold goes into vacuum, it then that vacuum also goes to the diaphragm of that blow-off valve and kind of assists it in opening. So it creates that big pressure difference between the two. So, yeah, they're relatively simple devices, but they can be messed up in many ways. Like I said, the wrong spring pressure, not a good vacuum source or too small of a vacuum source, and then just leaks. Leaks can be everywhere, whether it's
Mm-hmm.
internally or externally, to that blow off valve. Uh, and then in general, just boost leaks are your biggest enemy when it comes to turbocharging engines and supercharging as well, but maybe a little more common in turbo engines. But yeah, I mean that's so that covers, I guess, the colds or the pressure side. We call it cold side because it's still very hot, as I said, but it's a lot colder than the exhaust. So then your hot side, you kind of have you also have a similar device, but in this case, it's known as the wastegate, and it's doing a different job. So if the wastegate wasn't there, as your exhaust flow increases as you go to higher RPMs, you'll basically get to a point where you have too much exhaust per the kind of the turbo. I guess basically there's too much exhaust that doesn't need, you don't need it anymore to spin the turbo at the speed and for the pressure you need. So you need to start bypassing the turbine basically. So the wastegate can, usually you'll hear it, they'll either say internal or external. When they say internal, it's usually kind of integral to that turbine housing. And then it'll just have kind of an external actuator that'll be usually mounted to the compressor side of the turbo. And then I have a rod that's opening and closing that wastegate. So, and that'll also be controlled by in this case, a pressure source. So usually not vacuum. So this will be usually you get source from somewhere on the pressure side of the turbo. So between the turbo and the throttle body. And that will basically be the reference for it to whether it opens or closes. So once it gets to a certain pressure, it'll then push on that diaphragm. Whereas with the blow-off valve, it was pulling on it kind of in vacuum. Once you get to your target boost pressure, it'll push on that actuator, open up the wastegate, and then regulate it that way. And then, of course, there needs to be a spring in there that kind of prevents it from just opening immediately as soon as there's any boost. So based on what spring you have in there and that boost source, that's when it starts to open. And then the other method is what people call external wastegates. Those can be mounted in a couple different ways, but most commonly you'll find it on the exhaust manifold right before the turbo. So it's doing the same exact thing, but it's just an external part that you can add kind of yourself, that's not integral to the turbo, and potentially higher flow, which can be a disadvantage of the internal wastegates, but not always. And you can make an internal wastegate flow quite a bit. It's just whether or not it's designed for that. But with external, you're kind of more flexible. And in that case, you kind of add this separately and then have a pipe going basically from your exhaust manifold to the wastegate, and then it'll exit either after the turbine, so in your kind of downpipe into your main exhaust, or you can be hella cool and just vent that thing to atmosphere and have your screamer pipes, as they're called. That's it's another thing. It's a preference, I guess, whether or not you want to do that. Of course, that's not the most EPA friendly way of doing it, especially if you don't have any cats on your car. If you don't have any cats on your car, then it doesn't matter either way. It's all just shooting out there.
Yeah.
But if you did have a cat, then that's not no bueno for the emissions.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah. So, and it's the screamer pipe can be good in that it doesn't reintroduce that exhaust back into your flow and kind of mess it up after the turbine outlet. So there can be some advantages to it, but then you just have another pipe you have to manage the heat from, and
Right.
it can go either way. I think it's cool, and but most of the time you can have it reintroduced into the exhaust without much kind of detriment. So that's the way I would prefer it. Honestly, I mostly prefer the internal wastegates because it's all kind of integral, and don't have extra parts. But on stock turbos, it can quickly become your kind of big your big bottleneck in that system if you're just adding a ton more boost. But we can get into that a little bit later. But I guess just to finish it off, but yeah, I mean, as far as hardware, that after your wastegate, you have the exhaust coming off of the outlet of the turbo, and that's just going where it normally would to your muffler, or maybe not, or so that kind of finishes it off. With, I guess, the last thing they might add to that system is what we call a boost controller. So as I was saying, with that wastegate, you have a spring in there, and that's based on that spring that sets your kind of target boost. And then once it gets in there, the boost pressure kind of overrides the spring and opens the wastegate. But of course, that only leads you to that makes you need to change the spring every time you want to make a boost change. So one way you can kind of manipulate that is you add a boost controller. They can be just simple mechanical boost controllers, or kind of your electronically controlled. But they both work the same way. Basically, it's just a little bleeder, kind of a bleeder valve it's kind of manipulating that boost source that's going to the wastegate. And by bleeding some of that off, you kind of delay that opening by, maybe before, once the hose, the source got to 10 psi, it would open. But now by bleeding it off, maybe it has to get to 20 psi before there's enough pressure to overwhelm that bleeder valve to then push on the wastegate. So the mechanical style ones are usually just a simple knob that opens and closes it, kind of a needle valve, which will change that how much it bleeds. And then the other version is just a little solenoid that will basically do the same thing, but then can be controlled by your ECU, and so you can adjust that bleed rate. The nice thing about those is you can change your bleed rate through the rev range. So maybe it can compensate for maybe some boost spikes, and then maybe try to add more at the top end, or pull out boost towards the top end, or it can get into a lot of crazy and cool strategies, boost by gear, and that kind of thing, to try to limit wheel spin. But so electronic boost controls definitely has a lot of advantages, but then of course it can add some problems in your system. But for the most part, they're pretty robust. So but yeah, I just kind of went off there on turbos there. So it's one of my favorite things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we'll get into it a little more later down the line. We'll get maybe even closer to more engineering about sizing all this stuff and what to pick and why. And maybe you can tell us about, I hear some turds talking about changing housings, but not compressors, or vice versa. And maybe you can give us some more insight to that.
Oh yeah, I'd love to. But for now, we got to get in the superchargers.
Yeah. The objectively better boost device. Yeah. So superchargers, as Brian had already mentioned, are driven by the engine. So I guess before I get too far into the supercharger, generally this means you're going to have a belt from the crank somewhere on the engine driving your actual supercharger, your boost device in this case. Some things to keep in mind here is this will be parasitic now. It takes power to turn whatever type of supercharger you have. So even though you're not seeing that at the rear wheels, your engine needs to produce that. So, if it takes 30 horsepower to turn your supercharger, cool, you're getting 50 more horsepower out of the supercharger, whatever it may be. But that means you need to size your fuel system for 80 more horsepower, because the engine is getting that 50 extra that you're going to see at the wheels from the supercharger. plus the 30 that you're not seeing, but it's still generating to drive the supercharger. So something to think about there. And, in general, that's probably the biggest downside of superchargers. But there you go. So there's 3 main types. There's roots, twin screw, and centrifugal. I guess roots and twin screw are what we call positive displacement superchargers. So the roots style has lobes. The number of lobes changes. Generally, is just increased throughout the years. An older supercharger will have 3. Now they might have 4 or 5. It moves the efficiency map of the supercharger, which we can get into later. But the point is, these lobes contact each other, and so they have a Teflon coating, but they're actually there's a very small interference fit in the root style supercharger, and this is what makes it a positive displacement type of supercharger. So no matter what you have on either end, what pressures you're running, for one rotation of your pulley on the supercharger, you have X number of cc's of air coming out, no matter what, because this is a fixed volume. So these rotors are cammed together, or maybe timed, however you want to say that. So as you get from one end of the supercharger where you have the intake to the other, this area between the two is getting smaller. So if you think about them interfering in one spot, they're pushing the air right in front of that, right? And that's how they're forcing the air down the supercharger. And then this available area gets smaller and smaller, which is how you're building this pressure. So there you go. But at least for this type of supercharger, this interference fit does also create more heat. So we've already talked about some thermal problems. Here's some more, right? So it definitely creates a lot more heat. Maybe another downside, whatever. All of this doesn't matter if you've ever heard supercharger whine. It's all worth it. So, whatever. It's fine. So yeah, but because this is positive displacement, it's always pushing out air, and it's driven by the engine. So here you're not going to have to worry, or you won't have spool like a turbo. You're not spinning anything up. Obviously the supercharger spins faster with the engine because they're directly coupled, but you have boost almost right away. So there's another benefit. That's why you'll see superchargers on drag cars more often. Not necessarily more often than turbos if you just go to an open day on the drag strip, but where you see superchargers is less road racing because of some of the thermal problems I've already touched on and the parasitic issue. But also, it really helps in this drag racing environment. So anyways, then I guess you have the architecture of the engine, which will change how you couple the supercharger output to the engine. Most people that use it have a V8, right? So the supercharger fits right in that V. The output goes, right into your intake ports, and it's beautiful. And that's about it, really. It just sits right there. You can have a 4-cylinder like a Miata where you supercharge it. So now you have to route your supercharger from the outlet, or your boost pressure from the outlet of the supercharger to the intake of, your intake to your throttle body. So, this is where you would install your normal intercooler. If you're doing track days or something, you're probably going to have an air-to-air. this is going to be very similar to what Brian already talked about with the turbocharger. So, just you have this plumbing, these pipes, where you're going to put this intercooler. It's all very similar. And then, your boost pressure goes into your intake manifold. There's a couple different ways to do this. Some people limit the air intake on the supercharger side, on the intake of the supercharger. So they only have one throttle body, and it's not in front of the intake manifold. It's in front of the supercharger. And that's a perfectly fine way to meter your air. Another way to do it, if you like making things complicated, like me, is to have a dual throttle body set up. So you still have your normal throttle body in front of your intake manifold, but you have another one in front of your supercharger. If you still have that throttle body in your intake manifold, you're going to need to have a blow-off valve. For the same reason that Brian mentioned earlier, if you come off throttle, you close that butterfly valve. Now you have all this plumbed area, your intercooler and all your piping that's pressurized. That air has to go somewhere. So get it out of here, right? Get your blow-off valve and just shoot it out. And so, pro tip, do this. You get the cool turbo noises and the cool supercharger noises. I don't know why anybody would want anything else. So it's beautiful. Now you might be thinking, Eric, if I have a throttle body in front of my intake manifold, I'm metering air there. Why do I need one in front of the supercharger? Well, technically you don't, but it's loud. Very, very loud. I tried it. It sucks. It's not fun to drive. It's so loud. Apparently superchargers, that mechanism was originally designed to be a air horn. So, you'd warn your small little town of a tornado or whatever the fuck's coming with this thing, just to give you an idea of how loud and annoying it is. So this throttle body in front of it, at least in my case, was really just there for noise purposes. So I would recommend doing that if you're going to go with that setup. So yeah, I guess that's those. I'll touch on air to water intercoolers. Because you'll, again, in the drag racing world, you'll see this more often, which is going to be coupled with the supercharger. There's a couple ways to do this. So it's going to be a heat exchanger with cold water and for running through one end, and your boost pressure running through the other. If you're just at a drag strip, that's all you do. You're only going to make one pass. That's really all you need. So people will have a tank of ice water somewhere in the car, and obviously some sort of pump to run it through this, intercooler channel. And that's about it. If you plan on doing more than that, you can sort of see how you would melt this ice water, and it would eventually just heat soak. Potentially it would heat soak closer to your boost pressure than atmospheric pressure. And if you're trying to road race with one of these and you have only what I described before, it'd be better to have an air-to-air intercooler. You're just going to kind of shoot yourself in the foot. So on some of these systems, you'll see another air-to-water intercooler, which is meant to cool the water in your system. So you have ambient air going through a heat exchanger, which is cooling your water, which is then going through another heat exchanger, which is cooling your boost pressure air. So that's how that works. I've seen it a lot, honestly. If I was making a pass at the drag strip, I wouldn't bother with the added weight. But let's say you're going to race some ATSVs and you want to spend about as much as a, base model C8 on a cooling system. Here you go. Do that. It's great. So definitely not a story there. So yeah, I guess that's how your air to water intercooler is going to work. So that,
Yeah. So
yeah.
so it's basically just adding kind of another water radiator basically to your system. Similar. I mean, the intercooler is gonna your air to air intercooler is also adding another heat exchanger, but in this case, it's air to air. I guess, but real quick, you can do the same. You can do an air to water intercooler, as I kind of quickly mentioned, for a turbocharger setup.
Mm-hmm.
And they can be. I know the a lot of the BMWs, kind of stock BMW, the straight six turbo engines, they have an air to water intercooler. The Supra, I mean, since it has a BMW engine, also has that. So they can be found. That kind of, I think, more commonly nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, they both have their kind of trade-offs, with probably with the air to water kind of being a little more costly and kind of more parts and stuff. For the supercharger, I think it makes more sense because you can package it right there, between the supercharger and kind of the intake in a V8. But yeah, I mean, it's just, yeah, just another way to do things there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess on the note of having that in a turbo system, it's on the new Astons, which are twin turbo V8s, which is mostly an AMG engine. So I believe it's also in the Mercedes. So yeah, I mean, if you're filthy rich, you can find these in a normal, car you can buy from the factory. So, and Brian sort of mentioned I had talked about how this will package in something like a Miata. Brian did mention, this how you package this air to water intercooler in a V8, and this is really how you package it in any sort of V configuration, right? The 3800 SC, which is a popular-ish supercharged V6 from GM. Same thing. So, I had mentioned that the supercharger sits in the V and the output goes right into your intake runners. Well, whether it's from the factory or aftermarket, you can add this intercooler, which I would think of it as a plate with a very thin, heat exchanger. It looks like a radiator. It's just incredibly thin. So it spaces the supercharger up a little bit. And then you have an inlet and an outlet for water running through that plate. So it packages very easily as long as you have the room, to move that supercharger up half an inch. So it's very ideal there. So, yeah, I guess going back to the supercharger, all superchargers will have a bypass valve. And that's going to be, that essentially controls the pressure on the inlet and the outlet of the supercharger. So when you have low load, which is going to be based off of, a reference pressure somewhere, this valve is going to be open, and it allows the air at the outlet of the supercharger to go back in through the inlet. And that way you don't have a difference in pressure anywhere. You don't need to boost. Your engine's probably in vacuum. So that's what that's doing. Interesting note, the LT4 engine, so the C7Z06 or the CTSV, I don't know if anybody remembers, but GM had some warranty claims at the track about, these cars overheating. What was actually happening here is this bypass valve would open, but the way it was routed internally, the air never went through this heat exchanger that sits between the supercharger and the intake runners. It just went from the outlet to the inlet. So you're on throttle and you have this very high temperature boost pressure. You get off throttle and that very high temperature boost pressure just circulates through the supercharger, continuously heating up more and more and more and more and more. And well, that's why they had problems. So just interesting note there, I suppose. So I feel like that's pretty good for roots. If you move on to twin screw, the other type of positive displacement supercharger, it's similar, I think, to a roots, but instead of having, some lobes that are symmetric but timed, you have two very different looking, I guess they're not really rotors. One's a screw and one's I don't know what you'd call it, but you have a male and a female end. They look nothing alike. And the way they build pressure relative to each other is different, right? So think of it more as threads in a nut rather than these lobes from a front view. It's now more of a three-dimensional view where you're built, how you're driving this air from the back of the supercharger to the front. But because they do this, they run a very, very tight fit, but it's technically not an interference fit. But it's tight enough to still be positive displacement. They have more, they're not lobes in this case, but I'm going to call them lobes. They have more, features that intersect with each other. So these are actually going to give you a lot of the benefits of the roots, but get rid of a lot of that extra heat generation, and because it's not interfering as much, it's not going to be as parasitic. So they're better, I would say, except they're bigger and they're significantly more expensive. So there are downsides, obviously. But otherwise, it's very similar to a roots style supercharger. And so I guess the last one now is a centrifugal supercharger. Lots of people call these pro chargers. It's a similar thing with Kleenex, right? Pro Charger is a famous brand, so everybody calls them pro chargers, but it's a centrifugal style supercharger. If you look at one, you're going to say, oh, that looks like the compressor side of a turbo. It's because it essentially is, right? That's all that's going on there. And on the back, you have a pulley, which is connected to the engine. So yeah, I mean, that's how that one works. This is, if we're looking at these as pumps, which they effectively are, they're all air pumps. This is a variable displacement. So similar to a turbo, you will have this spool time. So that's fun. Because these don't fit in a V anywhere, these will all generally have blow-off valves. They're all going to be very similar to the cold side of a turbocharger. But in this case, they're driven by the engine, so they're still parasitic. In my mind, it's kind of the negatives of both worlds. Generally, I'm not a huge fan of these, but they are small comparatively, right? They're significantly shorter than your roots or twin screw style supercharger. So if you're not trying to fit something in a V, in between two of those heads, these will package much better. And I think that's probably why they're so popular, is they're very simple. Some of them are sealed. Sometimes you have to oil them, I think. But they're very simple, and they're pretty small, as I had mentioned. So they're out of every system, turbos, there's no exhaust side, right? And superchargers, they're just the easiest thing to package. So that's the biggest benefit there. And with fewer parts, they're not too expensive. So they're relatively budget friendly. But again, worst of both worlds. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean, I guess I rattled on them there a little bit, but I think that's most of it for superchargers. Is there anything you think I'm leaving out, forgetting?
No, I think it covers the basics pretty good.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I guess next would be, I think we could go into, kind of your pros and cons, which we kind of covered throughout, but we can kind of list them off here, both to between superchargers and turbochargers, as well as to their naturally aspirated counterparts. So I guess for one, like I said before, for downsides of turbos, um, is I mean, and with both of these systems, both turbos and superchargers, you're adding a lot of complexity to the system that wasn't there before. So
Mm-hmm.
more weight, more cost, more space, which can usually equal even more weight, or less aero efficiency if you're like a Formula One car or something like that. So that's the biggest thing, I think. And then turbos tend to be just hotter, but not to say that superchargers don't have their own heat issues, as we were talking about. But it creates a lot of extra heat, kind of external in the engine and internal. So your cooling system for just the engine, your engine water cooling system, is going to need to be beefed up. Not just because you're making more horsepower, but also because that air that's entering the engine is now hotter than it was before. It's no longer at ambient. It's going to be usually a bit above ambient, and maybe 20 to 30 degrees over. So it's going in hotter, and it's just going to need more cooling. So now your radiator needs to get bigger. Then you're adding your intercooler, whether it's a air-to-air intercooler or another air-to-water heat exchanger for your air-to-water intercooler. You're now adding more resistance, and more resistance to the air that's going through your cooling package, and then more heat from the backside of those heat exchangers going into your engine radiator. So it's a big cooling problem, especially in road racing. So drag racing, they can get away with a lot, since you're only going for 3 seconds to maybe 15 at the really slowest. Hopefully, if you're
Hopefully not if
supercharged,
you're boosted.
yeah, if you're boosted, I hope not.
Yeah.
But because of that, yeah, you can get away with quite a bit, because it's so short of a time. Nothing can really heat soak, and and then maybe that's synonymous with your kind of standard street cars, where you're just driving around like a normal person. Then you get on the highway and you do a quick pull or something. Like, you don't need anything too crazy, but you need to start considering it, though. I know for me in my Eclipse, a while back, I remember I was on the highway. It was a really hot day. It was like 95, almost 100 degrees, and I had the AC on. And, I had put a front mount intercooler on it, which it didn't have originally. I had the kind of a side mount off to the side that wasn't in front of the radiator. And, yeah, I was driving down. I was watching my coolant temperature, my coolant gauge just start to go up. So I turned the AC off and it went back down. So I was like, oh, well, I'm right at the limit there.
Yeah, there you go.
Right at the limit. So even just driving down the highway, it was starting to become kind of a problem there. So that's when I upgraded the radiator, and then I didn't have that problem anymore. But yeah, so just heat, lots of heat when it comes to turbos, and they kind of have that disadvantage to superchargers, because superchargers, aren't manipulating the exhaust at all, so they don't affect that portion of it. But there still is that need for an intercooler, so they have that downside to the supercharger, or to a naturally aspirated still. But yeah, and then I guess as far as downsides for turbocharging, generally it's going to be difficult to package in a V8, because you're needing to bring your exhaust. If you're just putting a single turbo, you need to bring your exhaust together somewhere where there might not really be space for it, which is why generally in V engines you'll see twin turbo setups, which kind of solve that exhaust routing issue, but then add twice as much piping and maybe double intercoolers in some cases, and just lots of pipes, lots of tubes, lots of areas to get boost leaks, lots of areas to just add cost and weight and all that kind of thing, all those kind of things. So yeah, it's definitely, if the car wasn't originally designed for it, it can be very difficult in some cars, which is why they might resort to a supercharger in some cases, or or you just give up and Ellis swap it or something.
Yeah,
So
they are pretty great.
But
Yeah.
what about what about downsides of superchargers?
Yeah. So, I think the most notable is the fact that they're parasitic in nature. So, I mean that really sucks when you're sizing everything, right? So some people might not ever get to it, like notice how bad that is. If you have some V8, you can go get an old LSA supercharger, throw it on, and call it a day. But when you're putting everything together, if it's 10%, which is going to change based off the type of supercharger, that can be huge, right? That's 10% more fuel you need, and your engine internals need to be able to handle that, right? If everyone tells you that, oh, your, rods are going to bend at 250 foot-pounds of torque at the wheel, you can't get 240 at the wheel because your engine is producing, what would it be in this case? 265, or enough to make 265 at the wheel. You're going to see 240, but your engine's more. So you already bent your rods and you never got to the limit that everybody else sees. So, the parasiticness sucks. Yeah, the temperature can be significant. I mean, all boosted applications are. As you mentioned, superchargers don't have to deal with exhaust gas, which is very nice. Before I installed a air-to-air intercooler in my car, so I figured I wasn't running a upgraded pulley at the time. I figured it'd be pretty simple. It's like 7 pounds at most. Getting on the highway, I broke 220 F. Intake air temp, just nuts. It's bad. I made all the piping for my intercooler later that day. But yeah, I mean, that sucks. And then I guess with superchargers, you're gonna hit an ultimatum. The roots and the twin screw are long. So if you don't have a V engine, packaging them will or can be relatively difficult. You need to line the pulley up. So you're not really free to put it wherever you want. The pulley on the supercharger needs to line up with the pulley on your accessory belt. So that's that. So, then you might be stuck with a supercharger. Like you might need one specifically from a kit that someone made for your car, which is lame. If you did an engine swap and now you're putting a supercharger in, maybe the supercharger is meant for the engine, but now your firewall's closer or something. I've ran into those issues. So packaging, you're really kind of fixed, which sucks. The centrifugal supercharger has the benefit of being small. Again, the belts still need to line up. But it has the benefit of being small, so it's much more flexible. And yeah, I guess, personal things that I ran into was a lot of belt problems, even though it came with a kit. Uh, I redid most of it, partially because I just like making things, but also the kit sucked. The tensioner was on the wrong side. So these pulleys had to be like super aligned to not throw the belt.
Mm-hmm.
And then you'd still have to tension the piss out of it. So then belts are consumables. If you don't have an auto tensioner, belts will be consumables. So that sucks. Again, a lot goes into making sure that's all lined up right. I guess I'm just trying to think of other problems I had. It's if you go too aggressive with the pulley ratio because you want more boost, because who doesn't? Your belts will slip. So then you need to worry about that. Either more ribs on the pulley, or you go to a different pulley where the actual ribs are, I guess I would say axial, right? To the center of the pulley, which is the type they have on drag cars. So I don't know. It's a relatively simple device, right? It's a couple gears mounted to rotors. But as with adding complexity anytime ever, it's more headaches. So yeah, I guess that's the downside. And even in superchargers where the boost is known to be a lot more immediate, very close to immediate, you're not going to be at the same level as a naturally aspirated engine in terms of throttle response. Because with a naturally aspirated engine, you're not waiting for anything. So even though your boost is being generated immediately because it's coupled to the engine, it has to go through all this piping into your intercooler, right? And you can tune to make this feel smoother and better, but at the end of the day, if you're looking for throttle response, you're not going to beat an NA engine. So even the things that brag about throttle response for boost aren't really there, So there you go, I guess. Temperature, parasiticness, those are my biggest problems.
Yeah. And so I guess one thing I wanted to get into is kind of the advantages of turbos over both superchargers.
That's not a thing.
And naturally aspirated. So I mean, you were talking about pulleys, right? So if you want to make a boost change on your supercharger setup, you need to go out and find another size pulley and bolt it up.
It's pretty easy though. Zip
whereas,
zap. 10 seconds with an impact.
And I'd argue you should just be similar with boost stuff. I've heard a lot of people always argue that, like, so as I was talking about earlier with mechanical boost control and electronic boost control, you can change it either as quickly as turning a knob, or even just in the ECU, you could have a button or a knob inside the car that you're changing. But I don't know, one thing I've kind of over time kind of learned is, I don't know, like, why wouldn't you just be running the most boost that you're planning to run? So
yeah, boy.
Unless you're running into problems, the traction issues, something, it is good to be able to tune it quickly. But for the most part, I imagine you should be setting it to kind of where it needs to be. But with that aside, where it does become an advantage for a turbocharger system is that, like I was saying earlier, you can run these strategies, different boost by gear, different boost per RPM, depending, and trying to keep it within the efficiency ranges of the turbo, basically, and which we'll get into kind of I think kind of part 2, talking about like compressor maps and all that kind of thing for both turbos and superchargers. I guess, are they called? They're not called compressor maps on a supercharger. They're called kind of, or are they?
They are not. I've only ever looked for them under like efficiency map.
Okay.
Because it's a fixed. ratio, right? Nothing's changing. But yeah.
Yeah, so being able in a turbocharged vehicle, especially with electronic boost control, being able to change it kind of on the fly, have different strategies, use it almost as a traction control, or I don't know, or just, yeah, I guess for like a street car, having a low boost and a high boost setting might be nice if you're just driving around, just trying to save fuel or something. You can save fuel using the throttle, so maybe that's not useful. But maybe in a road racing, like endurance racing situation where you need to save fuel to not give the driver any ideas of any more power, just since you're going to be full throttle, by limiting that boost, then you can save a lot more fuel, which actually goes into a downside that I think we kind of missed with both supercharging and turbocharging is fuel economy.
Oh, yeah, it's awful.
Very bad.
Yeah, I mean, so, you're running more fuel, right, with the more air like we referenced, but also like you mentioned in the beginning, you're running a richer ratio, I guess. You're under the 14.7 to 1, which is the stoichiometric ratio for pump gas to air, right? So we'll talk about that later when we talk about tuning and everything, but because you're running richer, you're running more because you're getting more power, but you're also running richer, so your efficiency is worse there. And yeah, man, I had a E85, which we can get into fueling and why in the next one, but I had E85 and I was filling up every 2.5 days. And, maybe I wasn't a 100% responsible granny, just putting around nice and slow, but not a jackass. And for the most part, I was just driving to work and back. It disappears quick. So.
Yeah. I guess, and one thing to clarify is, because nowadays we're seeing downsized engines and turbocharging used to improve fuel economy of vehicles. So there is, as long as you're, but of course, if you're so one thing if you have like an EcoBoost F-150 and you're just driving around town, not towing anything, you will notice better fuel economy. And there's a lot more lean burning strategies and everything that OEMs are developing to kind of help that. But if you're not really in the boost, you're effectively just driving around with a smaller engine that has less pumping losses, less friction, and that kind of thing.
Right.
And when you don't need the boost, that's where you're getting your benefit. But as soon as you're going full throttle, or say you're towing a full weight trailer and everything, you're going to see that fuel economy plummet. So it's it just depends on how you're operating the vehicle in that case.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's this for the same sort of power, the boosted engine, your EcoBoost in your example, will be running a little richer and it will be worse fuel economy. It's just the thing is when you're cruising on the highway and you're not into boost, then the V6 is more, it does have better fuel economy than a V8, right? Or whatever else they might throw in there.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's really just about giving you less power when you don't need more. Sort of that efficiency map we had talked about with the hybrid episode a little ways back. You're just getting closer to that engine, that efficiency island for the V6. Yeah, absolutely. And this is always gonna come back down to for a certain amount of power, there's a certain amount of energy stored in gasoline, and you need a certain amount of oxygen to burn with it, right? So no matter, there's nothing getting out of that, right? Outside of increasing engine efficiency, if you need X amount of power, you're going to need X amount of fuel. It's fixed. There's there's nothing extra there, right? Like, there's a specific energy of gasoline, and that's just sort of what it is. So yeah, I think it's a good point.
Yeah. So, but I guess going back to benefits of turbocharging, obviously the biggest benefit of supercharging and turbocharging is more power, but we kind of already went over that. For the same engine displacement, I guess is the qualifier there. So it can allow you to make a lot more power with kind of the same engine that came with your car. Of course, you start stressing things, you're going to start having to upgrade those internals very quickly, especially because you can ramp that power in real fast. So it's not just, it's not like free horsepower or anything. So, but yeah, I guess trying to think of more advantages, I guess specific to kind of professional racing, I feel like we've talked about this a little bit, but turbo engines can sometimes be easier to balance the performance, because all they have to do is just make a quick ECU boost map change if the series is forcing them to do a different boost map, whereas with a naturally aspirated engine they're going to change restrictors, which could change it's going to change the tune of the engine, so now they have to have separate tunes for different size restrictors, and a lot of times they'll just come up with some 21.633 millimeters or something, because they use some formula to kind of estimate your horsepower difference. So you're not going to have that on hand with you, unless you plan for every tiny little 0.1 millimeter change or something. So someone's gonna have to make that restrictor, and then you're gonna have to retune the engine kind of for that restrictor. So by just being able to change your boost map, everything should still be tuned properly with that change in boost. So I think that's part of the reason why we've seen most of the like say GTLM competitors go that way, but it's also because the road cars they're based on have turbochargers, so it's kind of hard to say if that's why they're doing it. But
it is significantly easier, though. I totally agree. And it allows the series to change different aspects of the engine performance, right? So they can turn down your boost, or maybe they can give you the same peak power, but they change the boost curve so that you don't have as much torque going up to it, right? It's I guess a steeper slope, maybe. So, and it's exactly what you said, right? That's how you did it with the Aston. Is those guys would send us a different boost map, or I guess it's probably the same boost map. They just give us a different file for that electronic boost controller, right? We just plug it in. Boop, boop. Call it a day. So, same.
Yeah, so it's definitely nice. And then, so otherwise...
Have I mentioned supercharger wine? That's definitely a pro. I'm not sure if I've mentioned that yet, but I think it's a pro.
Maybe. I don't know. Memory's a little bit fuzzy. But I mean, on the same note, turbocharger whoosh, not just the blow valve, but just the hiss, kind of the hiss you get as that thing spools up, and you can hear the power increase, basically. You have an audible cue, not just from I don't know, an engine can rev higher but have less power at high RPMs, right? It can start to fall off. So you're getting this audible feedback of it revving more, but like my Corolla that it revs to 6,500 maybe, but it doesn't have much above 5. So it's it's making the noise, but you don't feel it. Whereas with the turbo, when you hear that thing get louder and hissier, you feel it. It pushes you back in your seat. So that's fun.
Yeah,
But
with my blow-off valve for my dual throttle body setup, because it was just vented to atmosphere, you could hear it start to close. Because I was referencing pressure on the intake manifold for it. So I can go into that at some point if you want. But yeah, you'd hear it close, so you hear the air escaping and then like not. So on a similar note to what you just mentioned, you know, the boost is there, it's climbing, and you hear just, and then as soon as it stops, that blow-off valve was closed, and you're in for it. It was sweet.
Yeah, I feel like some people will say like, natural aspirated engines have the best character and everything, but I don't know. I like the kind of weird character that boosted engines can have, just because they just do a lot of different things. They have a lot more cues and everything, and they feel different. They can feel really slow, like in a turbocharged engine where you have the boost. But then they can all of a sudden, it ramps up at a higher rate than you'd ever see in a naturally aspirated engine. So it like kind of pushes you back.
Yeah, I mean,
but
I feel like with an electronic boost controller, you can get whatever character you want.
Yeah.
And if you want to talk about character, let's talk about the early version of the second gen MR2 or the late 80s Turbo 911, where you just had these awful oversteer moments because of turbo lag. That's character. You go from like 20 horsepower to 300. It's great. That's a lot of character. That's all the character you could want.
Yeah. It's, but I think that character can also make it difficult in a road racing situation to get it dialed in.
Absolutely.
I mean, one anecdote I think of is your supercharged Miata.
Hey.
Where how you had it set up, it was basically just a small amount of throttle would be full power and boost, and then you'd close it and it'd be done. So it's kind of all or nothing. There was no kind of modulating.
Yeah. If anybody wants to know how to, for on the street or on the drag strip is fine. It was great. If anybody wants to know how to get around that or why that was what was happening, because as I already sort of alluded to, I was referencing pressure in the intake manifold for the blow-off valve. So that way, as soon as you started to close the throttle, that pressure drops, boost pressure's gone. In a perfect world, if you're a perfect driver, it's not going to be a problem. You're only going to be coming off throttle when you're braking. But since I'm not fucking Jackie Stewart, we'd go from what was probably about 200-ish wheel horsepower to maybe 110 very quickly. There's some very fun oversteer, off throttle oversteer moments. So yeah, the way to fix that, or one of the ways, the way I would do it, is you would time the throttle body in front of the supercharger to be the limiting factor, right? I had the one in front of the intake manifold to be the limiting factor. Because if what's in front of the supercharger is limiting it, it's also dictating peak power, right? Because that is your restriction, that's your nozzle in the system. And I desperately needed that extra 1 to 2 horsepower, apparently, that not doing that would give you. So yeah, that's why that happened. And yeah, if the one in front of the supercharger's your limiting factor, that air will never get boosted, right? So as soon as you go off throttle, you shouldn't have this huge delta like we did. But character, Scribe, it's fantastic. It's not a negative.
Yeah.
It was fun. In fact, honestly, that would probably be a fantastic setup for any of you nerds who do autocross. Because holy shit, you just get off throttle and that car is yawing. Um, for on a full size track, maybe not the greatest. So
Yeah. Yeah. So but yeah, but it's it's character and it can be fun if that's what you're going for. If you're trying to win, maybe
maybe
not.
not.
But
Yeah.
you can't you can't win a track day as much as some people try. So it can just be fun.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I guess the final thing I was thinking of, at least I don't know if you have other thoughts, pros and cons and everything, but the final downside, I think the biggest downside, and we kind of touched on it throughout, is kind of that reliability and complexity. Adding all these things, especially in road racing, because road racing, and especially on top of that, endurance road racing, it's being able to last the whole race is kind of is the most important thing to do, and then you focus on speed from there. So if something's failing all the time, every time, it's not gonna help. And there's kind of a lot of mechanisms for it. I mean, it could be as simple as like I forget what year it was, but the 24 Hours of Le Mans, the almost about to win Toyota LMP1 car had I believe it was like a wastegate failure, or it's like a hose popped off basically of that boost source, and that caused the engine to basically go into limp mode, and they couldn't finish the race. They were leading. It was one lap to go, and the whole thing shut down. And so that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't naturally aspirated. Although something else on a naturally aspirated engine could break, but those parts are already all there. So either way, so there's that. But then, as we were talking about heat and heat soaking, so maybe your intercooler seems just fine on track days, 20-minute sessions, that kind of thing. But when that thing's going for hours and hours and hours, and you're drafting behind someone for a while and all that sort of thing, like that, those intercoolers can get very hot, and then all of a sudden basically just almost not work anymore, because they're so hot that any air coming in just doesn't have enough to cool it enough. And then your engine gets hotter and hotter, your engine water gets hotter and hotter, and then just things can start to melt. That's what I've seen most often in turbocharged, at least, vehicles at the track. And so yeah, it's definitely the biggest challenge in the road racing scene with turbocharged vehicles, getting them to last. Obviously you can go buy a turbocharged vehicle and drive it around a track and probably be okay, but it's just as soon as you start adding power and especially in like endurance racing, track, as we say, as I said, track day is one thing, going 8 hours straight is a whole nother deal.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty good for the cons. I guess the biggest pro, to sort of reiterate, that I'm sure most people are aware of, is, as you mentioned, with just another about 15 psi, you just doubled your engine's power. These things are probably some of the most economical ways to get more power. You're not going to get nearly as much out of a cam as you will an equivalently priced cheap China turbo, right? Even if you ball out and get like a nice Garrett, the power increase you can see will be substantially more, so it's a good way to just get more power in general. So that is, I guess, just to throw a high note back in, since we were just ragging on them.
yeah,
it's a good cheap way to get power, especially if you don't want to engine swap something, right?
yes.
Suppose you can get a $500 V8 from a junkyard, but that'll take a lot of work. So,
yeah. So, but yeah, I think that's a good place to kind of wrap up. Like I said, I think we'd like to revisit this at some point and get kind of more into the nitty gritty. both setups. But yeah, I think we'll save that for another day. There's always another podcast every week, so
That's right. Tune in.
There's always another time to talk about this. So yeah, I mean, and of course, if you want to see when those latest episodes are coming out, I mean, usually it's every Monday, but if you want the latest updates, you can follow us on the social medias, our Facebook or Instagram at Motorsports Tech Talk. I guess a bonus thing coming up soon is I'll be live streaming my Spec Miata race, assuming the car is finished for it. And typically I do it just to my personal YouTube, but I think I'm going to start doing it to the Motorsports Tech Talk page just to kind of throw in some more content there. So, so I should be doing that. And you'll be listening to this hopefully this Monday, and then so basically a few days, the coming weekend, I'll be live streaming. So, I'll be posting the links and everything to my personal Facebook, of course, as well as the Motorsports Tech Talk social media platforms. So yeah, keep an eye out for that. Yeah, and also if you just have any feedback for us, feel free to reach out to us. But yeah, thanks again for listening in and sticking with us this long, and we appreciate you, and we look forward to talking to you guys again soon.
Yep. And I guess quick shout out to the last PC race or prototype challenge race. Volt Team won. So congratulations to those guys.
Nice.
Yeah, buddy.
Nice.
So yeah, just throwing that out there. But otherwise, thanks for listening. And see ya.